All right, so AIM 11.6, what was life like for slaves along the Middle Passage and how do we know? We just went over some responses to the do now question, so away we go. All right, I will give you a second for the notes and then we will go over them. All right, so while you finish up, this is not new information to us. We've gone over this already. But the idea that during the Columbian Exchange, which is the assignment that you guys completed yesterday, the contact between Europeans and natives resulted in the Europeans transmitting a lot of diseases to the native population that had very, very serious impacts for them. We went over the idea of immunity and the idea that when you're exposed to certain germs and bacteria, for generations, you develop natural immunity to those things. And when the Europeans showed up, they brought germs and bacteria with them unknowingly that natives had never been exposed to and therefore didn't have this natural immunity to. And these germs and bacteria cause very, very serious sickness amongst the native population, namely smallpox, measles, syphilis, and other diseases, but those are the big ones. But when we talked about the idea of encomienda system 2 days ago, we talked about how that whole social system was built as a system of labor, right? The idea was that the natives would perform the labor and the European settlers would benefit from their labor. And that was the idea. But the problem is because of these diseases, all of these natives are dying off. So that means this source of free labor that was once available to the Europeans is disappearing before their very eyes. So the Europeans have a new problem, and that problem is where are they going to get cheap or free labor from? And that births the transatlantic slave trade. I'll give you a second here. All right, so while you finish here, so like we said, this transatlantic slave trade is about a need for labor because the native population was dying off and they were the workers, right? So the Spanish will start to bring slaves from Africa to the New World beginning in the early 1500s. So between the 1500s and the 1800s, roughly 10 million African slaves are brought by Europeans to the Americas as free labor. The number of slaves in the American South was actually not as numerous as you think. The prevalence of African slaves in Central and South America was actually far greater. So the way it works was that I think a lot of people have this vision of the slave trade as Europeans showing up on the shores of Africa and then going inland and kidnapping people out of their homes and their villages and their towns and then basically whisking them away. And that's not really exactly how it happened. I'm sure there were isolated incidents of things like that, but in general, that wasn't the common practice. The way this worked was West African tribes that lived along the coast would conquer neighboring people inland. And then they would say, these people are prisoners of war, and they would sell those prisoners of war to European slavers. This became kind of a lucrative thing. Now, people began to go to war specifically to get these prisoners and then sell them to European slavers. So this is in general how the bulk of the slave trade takes place and gets started. After the Europeans get a hold of these slaves, they transport them to the Americas along what's called the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is a nickname for the trip between Africa and the Americas for slaves. This results in what's called triangular trade. I want you guys to take a second here and just copy down this kind of chart a little bit. The important pieces are, as usual, what's in red here. So we need to know Americas, Europe, Africa, what is going from each place to the other, okay? So in Africa, we know the slaves are being brought from Africa to the Americas, right? So once the slaves get to the Americas, those boats drop off slaves and they pick up cash crops and raw materials that have been removed from those colonies. They then take those cash crops and raw materials to Europe. Once they get to Europe, they unload those raw materials and cash crops for use in Europe. They are paid for those things with manufactured goods and technology, things that you use the raw materials to make. And then they take those things to Africa and they trade manufactured goods and technology to coastal Africans in return for those slaves, and around we go. Okay, this is important to understand. We need to know the three regions that are in play here: the Americas, Europe, and Africa. And we need to know what is being traded between each of those places. So take a second right now and copy down this chart, and we will continue in a second. So while the rest of you finish up with this chart, I'm going to start talking about what the activity is going to be for today. So what you are going to do here is we're trying to answer the question, what was life like for the slaves along this middle passage? So this trip here, Africa to the Americas, what was this trip like, and how were people treated, and how do we know? So what we are going to do for our activity today is you guys are going to look at two different sources, okay? You're going to look at a source from a slave ship captain that describes that trip and the treatment of slaves along that trip. And you are also going to take a look at a document from a slave on that trip, an educated, freed slave that made that trip. They're going to write a document about that trip also. That person's name is Equiano, and they are a famous source for this because it is the one of the very few instances we have where slaves actually become free and educated enough to provide a primary source for these kinds of topics, okay? So you're going to look at an account from a slave ship captain, and you're going to look at an account from a former slave. And what we are trying to do is, through examining the descriptions of each of these sources, we're trying to figure out what do they have in common that we can kind of latch onto as being true, okay? Last period, when you looked at the speech from Biden and the speech from Trump, one of the questions in your activity was, what is similar between these in messaging? And we said that the similar message there was, everyone needs to stop this and go home, right? That's what you guys had to say. So I'm trying to find that here. What is the slave ship captain saying? And what is the former slave saying about those conditions along the middle passage that they agree with each other and we can count as truth? And that's really what we're after. And what that is called is corroborating evidence. Okay, so the last thing I want you guys to get down in your notes here is this, this vocab word. And while you do that, I will go in and assign the classwork.